Yeah, I wanted to run for office because I wanted to make a difference in my community, which I think is a pretty standard reason for people to run for office. I will tell you, I started way back in the day as an activist and um, got really upset with the lack of progress that I was making in making changes. And so I decided to go to law school and went to law school thinking I could make change from within and realized that that was not 100% true either. So, the problem is when you're in law school and you become a lawyer, you have to follow laws. And if laws are not written well and they're not written equitably, then you still have to follow them. So I decided to follow that trail up and go to lawmaking instead so I can try to change things from the top down. I have a lot of feelings about Black History Month. My right, I think the classic feeling is it's the shortest month of the year. My gosh, why do we have the shortest month of the year? But beyond that, my struggle with it is that when we look at Black history, and I understand why, but so much of it is focused on the struggles that we've overcome, um, as opposed to a celebration of what we've accomplished. And I would really love to see the narrative change a little bit to talk about what we have accomplished, not just during the civil rights movement, but moving forward. We have so many amazing Black African American individuals who have contributed to our communities and societies and have made huge differences. And I love that my daughter, who's 8 years old, is learning about Rosa Parks and who's learning about Harriet Tubman. But I also want her to learn about, Mae Jemison, who was the first Black woman in space, right? I mean, these are the sort of things that I want her to think about because it's not just there was a struggle and then people fought and the struggle's over. I want her to see what we've accomplished from there and how we have grown and contributed and have done amazing things because I don't think we focus on that enough. I mean, that's a good question. I think history is history and we should be teaching all of it. And I don't think there needs to be shame in teaching all of it. So before I was in the legislature, I was a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional. And so I did a lot of talking to large groups of white people about equity and why it's important. And we would field a lot of questions about, well, this makes me feel bad because of whatever history, or it's not my fault that my grandparents or obviously not grandparents, my great great grandparents owned slaves. And I'm like, no, totally understood. Look, I am half Black, half white. My great great grandparents owned slaves, okay? Like, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person, but if you choose to ignore that history and that reality and, don't acknowledge it, then that is a bad thing. Nobody's saying that you as a person are at fault for this, but the reality is it did happen and it has lasting consequences on what is happening currently. So you can put your head in the sand and say that it doesn't have any impact and we're all equal. And if you don't succeed, then that's your own personal fault. But I think deep down, and I think this is why it's difficult for us to talk about, I think it's why we're getting pushback on critical race theory. Deep down, we know that there were grave inequities that happened to Black people, but also to Native American people, to Asian Americans, to Latinos, that have impacted their quality of life to this very day. And if you choose to ignore that, and if you choose to pretend like it never happened, and if you make policy decisions that don't attempt to rectify that, then you're complicit in it. I mean, Black history is American history, right? Like if you don't learn about Black history, you are missing huge chunks of our literal history. I think the first time my eyes were really open to this in more than just a theoretical way where somebody says Black history is American history was really in constitutional law in law school, when it was like every major decision that has been made in the past 150 years was mostly about race or gender and how to keep those individuals under control or to tamp them down. And the very fact that so many of the court cases that we refer to as being like the classic court cases, you know, Brown versus Board of Education, Plessy v. Ferguson, you know, all of these court cases that we know by name, even if you don't know exactly what happened to them, you recognize the name, were all about Black history. So if you don't learn about Black history, you are missing out on some of the fundamentals of our constitutional law. And, you know, if you want to be a well-rounded, educated individual and you claim to love the Constitution, it's time for you to learn about Black history. Yes. So my dad is a veteran. He was stationed in Honolulu. That's how my family ended up in Hawaii, or, you know, part of my family ended up in Hawaii. But he was originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and grew up there in the 50s and 60s. And, you know, had a lot of firsthand encounters in the segregated South. And it's really interesting to me because that side of my family doesn't like to talk about the civil rights movement. I mean, you really have to pull the history out of them to get them to talk about it because it was traumatic. You know, it's not something, I think when we see it on the screen and when we see video of it or read stories about it, it seems like it was ancient history. But the reality is, you know, my family participated in bus boycotts. My family, Martin Luther King spoke at my family's church. My dad was distant cousins with one of the girls who died in the church bombing in Birmingham. I mean, these are like real live things that happened to them during their day-to-day life. And I think, you know, present day being the exception, living with COVID-19, those were unprecedented times that left a huge scar on them, I think emotionally, and it made it really difficult for them to have conversations about that time period. So I carry that with me, I think. Obviously, I didn't live through it, but when I am watching movies about that time period, looking at documentaries, reading books or essays about that, I have to really remind myself, and I try to always keep in mind the humanity of those groups of people. I think it's easy to think, you know, the civil rights movement was a group of people that were doing this thing, but they were also just trying to live their lives, right? I mean, my dad has 5 brothers and sisters, and his parents were trying to just have jobs and pay for their existence. And, you know, in the meantime, in their off time raising 6 kids, go to church and hear about what's happening in the civil rights movement, participate in various marches and, you know, boycotts, you know, doing all of that in their extra time while just trying to live their lives and be treated as equals. So I think it's important for us to remember the humanity aspect of that. And, you know, hopefully individuals who do have family members who live through that, I strongly encourage you to talk to them, learn more about that history, because my fear is that the regular, non-glamorous human part of that history will die because of the collective emotional trauma that folks experienced.